I'm Wayne Roosa. I teach all the art history courses at Bethel. Basically run the art history program as a one-man program. I also chair the art department and provide leadership in that area. In my teaching, I do favor lecture. It's partly because there's so much material to learn in art history classes. There's so much to cover. I also find that students typically have less background in art history than they might in history or science or literature. So there's a lot more to make sure they get down. I do have a lot of studio students in my classes, and I partly feel that in their studio classes they get enough critique learning where they learn how to dissect work. So part of my knowledge is to fill in a background of knowledge. Part of my role is to fill in a background of knowledge, so they understand what the ancient Greeks started, how those ideas are current all the way up through the present day, and give them that kind of broad base. Also, that kind of cultural awareness. Preparing lectures for me is an interesting thing. I remember a number of years ago, I think it was one of the faculty development grants we had, the presenter made a case for viewing a lecture as a performance. And a number of faculty members said, I really don't want to feel like I am performing. I want to deliver my material. And I thought a lot about that because I think the way I view a lecture is that each discrete lecture, well, let me back up. I think the way I view lecturing is that I view lecturing as an art form. Not so much as a performance. I don't think I'm a good performer. But I do view a lecture sort of as a bit of an art form. I mean, it's a discrete number of minutes. You have a certain amount of material you want to cover. What you have, or I feel what I have to do is begin that with some reason that this matters to the students. One of my favorite undergrad teachers when I was an undergrad, he pestered us to no end with the question, well, why is that significant? Why is that significant? It drove us nuts. But that actually became a formative question in how I approach teaching as a lecturer. That I feel like somehow up front I have to convince the students why it's significant. Now, that's kind of easy for me because I'm teaching the history of art, and art is human expression. Art deals with the spiritual, the political, the aesthetic. I mean, every human capacity is addressed in the arts. So for me, when I prepare a lecture, I think, what's the hook? What's the thing that actually matters, even if this happened 800 years ago? Why is it still a human issue? Why is it a creative issue? And I try to open each lecture with something like that. And then it's sort of an Aristotelian plot form. It's like, that's the inciting incident of why it matters. Then who's the cast of characters? And I bring the artists out one after another, their work, their themes, the context they're working in. My sense of art is that artists were never making work to be in the art history books. They were making work to be in life, no matter what time they were living. And that's pretty much the way I present it in lecture. I try to make it feel as if these were creative folks trying to figure out meaning, trying to figure out ideas, trying to figure out expression. And my job is to put that on the screen and unpack it for the students. In the meantime, you have to work in necessary facts, names, dates. You have to work in analysis of each work. You have to develop themes. You have to remind them that historians have a methodology, so I'm coming from a point of view. You're trying to weave in a lot of layers as you present a body of work or a period of work to students. So those are a number of the things that I think about. The funny thing about my discipline is it occurs in the dark. I'm off in the corner blabbing, and the students are sitting in the dark taking notes, and we're all looking at a screen together. So I also have to think a lot about the visual interest, how I shift from a whole image to details to keep that alive. And I kind of choreograph the visual, kind of the visual component of the lecture. Underlying everything I'm talking about is sort of more the technical problem of the visuals. And this isn't just limited to art history. This would be anyone who's using visual aids, visual material. I mean, the obvious things are it should be interesting, it should be visually engaging, but there's ways to do that, and I think the way I do that is two or three things. One is comparative material. I'll put up the work of art that's the centerpiece, let's say, of the first 10 minutes of the class. I'll leave that long enough for them to feel like they've started to move their eye around and kind of get that piece. But there's a certain point at which you see the student's eyes drifting off, at which point I like to bring in a comparison. It might be a detail of that work, which suddenly makes them look more closely. It might be a different artist's work that is in dialogue with that first one, so that comparative thing. And I mean, I see the students, they're looking at the one, and then they look at the other one, and then they're kind of looking back and forth. And then, of course, what I'm saying is directing them to do that. They need to get in deep. Now, I don't know what the counterpart in other disciplines would be, but for me, that's details. So to bring them in really close to a detail where the whole thing's still there, but there's a detail here, where they start to understand the whole, how the artist has put together all these parts to create a piece. For years, I just worked with slides, which are pretty clunky. I then went to PowerPoint. PowerPoint's great, but it's not great for what I do, for that subtlety. It's too clunky to do comparisons. It's too hard. There's a new presentation software that ArtStore provides, which actually anybody can download free and use. It will upload your PowerPoints, by the way. It's called offline image viewing. And it's fantastic because you can have a single image, you can go to comparison, go back to single, you can hold a single, zoom to the end of your lecture and bring in another one, or you can zoom in without losing focus on a detail and travel all around. And that really engages students. Yeah, that's a judgment call. Well, I'd say several things. I know when I feel it's been successful, as in the way I was able to articulate the material that given day seemed to click, it seemed to flow. It's kind of just a gut feeling. You can tell when students are tracking, I think, although sometimes I'm surprised, but you can usually tell when they're tracking, especially if they interrupt you and ask something. Sometimes I don't feel like I know until they write the essay exams, to be honest. And I think, that was a brilliant lecture, how could you write that? Or I'll think, I was just kind of getting stuff out and then you wrote that. It's like, so it does depend a lot on the students and the chemistry of the class. But if I got through the material in a way that felt like it had that choreographed feeling, started out with what's significant, worked through it, pulled it apart, and then pulled it back together, there's usually kind of an energy in the class that you can feel from that. First, let's talk about the times I've tried to get students maybe more verbally engaged, which is a dilemma for me because there's so much material that I do tend to lecture a lot. But I've had semesters where I thought, and I'm going to find pauses and try to engage students more. And what I found is that only works if I really prep them for that. I let them know that that's coming. If I pause in a lecture, even though I might think it's a great moment, if they don't feel prepared, they tend to withdraw. They're nervous, they're afraid of saying something they might think is silly or whatever. So in terms of that kind of engagement, I found in a way it's like letting students know what to expect is going to happen in the class that day. And I actually typically start every class by saying, today here's what we're going to cover. Here's my goal for this class. Maybe I don't always say it in that stilted of a way, but so I think that's one thing that has worked when I do it well. It's kind of flopped when I've just surprised them with stopping and asking a question like that. There's always a number of students who maybe this is not their best learning style, and I worry about those students, whether it's working well for them. to do two things. One is I want to kind of figure out like place and time. You know, where we are in this course, what we're going to study. The other thing I want to do is what I'm just going to call kind of a visual exercise, which is about ways of seeing. And we're going to talk about seeing. We're going to do some fun things together there with 4 works of art and try to become conscious of how it is we see. I mean, you're also used to seeing that we don't quite think about how we see. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But first, let's kind of locate ourselves. The class is called Renaissance through the Rococo. That happened sometime way back in history. So I thought we ought to get our moorings a little bit. So let's start and talk a little bit about Renaissance. And I know you probably all had either CWC or Western Humanities. So yeah, there's a chair there. So what's Renaissance? What's that word? We're just getting our moorings here. Yeah, rebirth. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is a term they gave themselves. Now, most art history periods, it was scholars later who gave the terms. I mean, if you go back to 5th century BC Athens, I do not think those guys were sitting around saying, oh, we're the classical period, so we better behave classically, and we better make some art that's going to look classical. No, they were just living their lives, okay, and making what they made. But in the Renaissance, they actually did sit around and say, we're the Renaissance. Okay, so that's interesting. And in fact, that's one of the sub-contents of this period, is that really from the Renaissance forward, there is a new historical self-consciousness in Western culture. It's with the Renaissance that people start to say, where are we in history in a new way? So the fact that they name themselves with a term that gives a content is pretty interesting. So rebirth, well, what does that mean? Is this Christian rebirth? No, they were already born again, right? It's a cultural rebirth. Well, a rebirth of what?
Their definition of values?
Yeah. Actually, they're going to get seriously redefined in this period.
Does it have anything to do with reusing Greek and Roman ideals?
It does. It has a lot to do with reusing Greek and Roman ideals. And when they start reusing those, their values, their notion of themselves is going to change. So that has to do with this historical awareness. So let's get those folks on the board. These Arabs, and they find out that the Arabs have these phenomenal libraries full of what? Books written by Plato, Aristotle, books on science, books on medicine. And they say, that stuff's brilliant. Where'd it come from? And they get interested in this. Okay? And so a whole revival starts where these thinkers start, in a way, it's not quite true to say, but in a way they leapfrog over to recover this. But I think they also pass back through this because they really are Christians. I mean, it really is a Christian culture. And so they're really taking their new Christian understanding of reality, moving it back through and merging with some of the wisdom and deep learning of the ancient Greeks and Romans. And so what I want to say is this so-called rebirth, you really might think of as a synthesis of what they're going to call antiquity. Antiquity is their shorthand to say Greeks and Romans. And they actually, the truth is, they kind of saw the Greeks and Romans as one mass. We make distinctions now.
But it's kind of a synthesis then of antiquity, and we'll just say Christianity. But by that I mean the whole medieval culture. And something new comes out of that synthesis. An amazing culture actually comes out of that synthesis. And that's what we're going to start off studying, about half our semester together. We'll try to figure out what is this Renaissance thing? What's their understanding? And I mean, it's sheer genius what they figure out. Okay, so that's our timeline, right? So now we know when we exist in this course, and we've got a few big ideas. Okay, but this is an art history course, so the worst thing you do is leave you with words on a board. Nothing against words on a board, I like them. But now we ought to talk about this as a visual. There's a visual history here. And that visual history is deep, it's philosophical, it's aesthetic, it's beautiful, it's full of tensions. So what we're going to want to do is come to understand these cultures visually, through what we might think of as visual discourse, which is what I think art history is. But today we're not going to worry about what period they are, or that kind of thing. Today I want to just spend a little time together on this business of seeing and how an image looks. Okay? Because part of this is about a kind of visual literacy, learning how to read an image in the way that it's put together. So what I've done is I selected a theme which is just obsessive in the Renaissance, which is the Madonna and Child. Okay? Virgin Mary with the Christ child. It comes up over and over and over. I actually took an entire graduate seminar on the Madonna and Child from 1150 to 1335. Okay? I was so sick of the Madonna and Child by then, but it was a great course because we learned this thing about seeing. So I picked out 3 or 4 images of this theme, and what I want to do is spend a few minutes looking at them together and sort of seeing how they're put together visually. Get us used to talking about that a little bit, and we'll try to come to an understanding of what an image is. Now, this is a little bit artificial, but a nice way to do it is to break this down a little bit. So, actually, can you see the board? Do I need to put the light up a little bit? Is that okay? Yeah. Yes, in the back? Okay. So let's say what we're dealing with, big picture, is an image, right? But let's kind of break it down a little bit. For example, we're going to talk with each image about its subject matter, okay, which is pretty literal. What's the picture of? If you get out your driver's license, there's an image on it. If I say, what's the subject matter? The subject matter is your face. But beneath that, we might want to start talking about the content. Now, that gets a little more interesting. We're looking at your driver's license. Strictly speaking, the subject matter is your face. Okay, but what's the content of that? Well, for the state of Minnesota, or wherever you hold your license, the content of that is your identity. That's how we know you from you. And if you get in trouble, that's how we're going to make sure you get arrested and not you. Oh, sorry, not you, probably you. No. Okay? Content's a deeper thing. And they're linked, though. Subject matter is linked to content. And this is the thing that's so crucial for you to get now. And it's something we take so for granted that sometimes it's hard for me to get you to think in these terms. To have an image that has subject matter, that has content, we're depending entirely on the visual vehicle. Okay? And you're looking at your license and saying, well, that's my face, of course. But no, it's not. It really is a set of forms. It's a set of forms. two little oval shapes. Okay, well, you call them your eyeballs, but they're forms. Bigger oval shape. Okay, another oval shape. Certain color, certain texture, light and shadow falling on it. Okay, it's really forms that makes possible subject matter and content. And so, when you look at this, you go to a museum and you see this and you say, oh, it's a medieval icon. It's the Madonna and Child. And some funny figures standing up there. Don't know what they're about. I mean, that's true. That's accurate. But it's really in the way this artist has used shapes and forms that is going to convey to you something about content. Okay, now to get at that, let's put a couple side by side. Okay, here's two paintings: Madonna and Child, and Madonna and Child. Okay, I've got a support cast, little support cast. Okay, now obviously these look very different, right? Now, just humor me here. Because I want you to give me the obvious. Don't think this is like some secret knowledge. Just describe for me a little bit how each one is put together, how each one looks as an image. We'll kind of warm you up on talking about images a little bit.
The one on the left is more two-dimensional.
Okay, good. The one on the left is more two-dimensional. The one on the left is more three-dimensional. Okay, visually, how does that happen?
The body proportions are very inaccurate in the left one.
Okay, true, but you slipped a gear on me. Hold that thought.
Use space.
Yeah, okay, visually, flat, deep, okay, they use the space. Okay, now push it a little bit farther. Visually, formally, what has this artist, Marghiatone d'Arezzo, done to make you read that as flat? And what has this artist, Raphael, done to make you read that as deep? I mean, see how quick your eyeballs are so smart. Your eyes immediately say, oh, flat, deep. Okay, but now, visually, how did they do that? Yeah.
The landscape in the backgrounds of black and white.
Okay. Okay, the landscape in the background. Now, see, as soon as you say background, you just implied a whole lot. Actually, as soon as you say in the background, how did he do that visually?
With the color.
Color's one thing. Okay, explain.
Well, with the one on the left, you only have just the one solid color behind Madonna. So it's, she is the prominent figure, and there's really nothing more for your eyes to travel back to.
Okay. Okay, good. Now, I know this is simplistic, okay, but we've got to get simplistic to really master this formal thing. And you're absolutely right. I mean, here, the whole background is one uniform color, no color change. Therefore, your eyes read it as flat, as not deep. Okay? Raphael, he's changing colors. And so your eyes are reading it as something's happening there. Okay, so color's a big thing. What else has happened visually to make us say flat versus deep? Yeah.
Well, like the horizon line in the back of that one, like goes with color too, but that one doesn't have any horizon line, and the figures are just like floating.
Okay.
And so they could be like just little figures up close to you, or in the back. You can't really tell by that one.
Okay. Okay, good, absolutely. I mean, so horizon line. Now that's a loaded thing. I mean, for example, I could draw a line. I'd be shot for it because it's a museum, but I could draw a line and say, well, there's a horizon line. But none of you would be saying, well, the landscape goes into the net, right? Yeah.
There's atmospheric perspective, so like as it goes back, it gets lighter.
Okay, atmospheric perspective, which on one hand is color change, which we talked about, but on the other hand is change in detail. Things in the front are much more specifically painted with harder edges. Things in the back are painted with blurred edges. Because Raphael knows that that's how your eyeballs work. When you look in the depth, you don't see detail. When you look up here, you do. And your term is exactly right. We call it atmospheric perspective. He's painting the sense of the atmosphere. What else? What are you doing?
I was just going to say, like, a perspective,
Right, exactly. Which is the other system of perspective. Atmospheric perspective is one thing. That's painting the light and the way it looks. Rebecca's referring to linear perspective. But the point being, you see, we relate to these images so differently, even though they both are the same subject matter. Okay? We relate to them so differently because the forms are different. And the artist has been able to create different worlds within these. All right, so how does that have to do with content then? Do these paintings have different content? Same subject, Mary, Jesus, different forms. Does that affect content? Yeah, a bunch of you are not. I mean, tell me about that.
It's the one on the right. There's a lot more emphasis on the physical bodies of people.
Okay.
Whereas on the one on the left, they're just kind of there because they are who they are. They're just kind of floating there.
Okay. Okay. Good.
seems like the one on the left is focusing on the, like it's an icon, and it's not realistic because it doesn't matter if it's realistic. But the one on the right is focusing on Christianity.
Okay. Okay. Now you just really cheated because you threw in the word icon. So suddenly our brains go click, 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 click. Oh, okay. That's okay. But you're right. All right, let's try it this way. What really is the content of this subject matter, say for Christian thought? Mary holding the baby Jesus.
I think it's a relationship.
It's a relationship. It's a big theological item. It's the incarnation, right? It's the incarnation. God becomes man via the body of a woman. Okay? Incarnation. We all, if you know anything about Christian theology, you know that incarnation is crucial to salvation. Okay? So if we say that's kind of the content, and now we play with this, okay? These forms. Look what you've got here. Okay, incarnation, woman, child. Okay, so we get incarnation. But how incarnate is it? Incarnation, literally incarnate in meat, okay, in the flesh. Someone said this emphasized actual bodies more in nature, in the world. You see, this is an interpretation of what that means, incarnation. It means somewhere in other spiritual realm, God enters this natural realm, becomes human, with a human flesh and blood mother, sitting in nature with the sun falling on them. So that's one way to understand incarnation. This artist doesn't quite see it that way. This artist has an understanding of icon, that a picture is a membrane, a window, where you understand the deeper truth through meditation and prayer. And so it's sort of realistic enough to make you say Mary and Jesus, but it's actually quite abstract because this is a mystery. And that mystery is abstract. And so the icon, in other words, they both say incarnation, but through different worlds of form. Okay? And so we feel them differently. It doesn't hold still. For example, we could go to this painter who's working about 20 years later than Raphael. And his name is Parmigianino. We'll meet him later. Okay, we're still on the same subject matter, Madonna and child. Our forms have changed yet again. Okay, describe for me a little bit.
It's very elongated.
It's very elongated. Yeah, I mean that's interesting, isn't it? Hold still. You know, this Madonna seems to have a certain set of proportions, and I'm guessing when you look at her, you're thinking those are pretty much right. Those are pretty much natural, a little bit idealized, but pretty much natural proportions. This Madonna is very elongated. In fact, I mean, actually, take a moment and look. Okay, let's start with that neck. I mean, she's really elegant, isn't she? She's like the queen of heaven. She's gorgeous. But I mean, that neck is like crazy. Or that hand there. I mean, how long are these fingers here? You start measuring out ratios or proportions. Why a different set of forms now? Or how about space? We were doing nicely with space. Compare the spaces here for me. I mean, it's like Raphael, he's used that perspective we're talking about to create kind of a plane of the land, and it kind of comes back. And don't you feel like this is sort of set in a stable way in that 3D space? Whereas Parmigianino, I mean, in one way, he gives us super deep space back here. And yet right here, he slams it right up against the picture plane. Okay. This is so easy to move your eye through. This one is like, and she's right here. And if you step a little to the right, you're going to like plunge 20 miles deep. Okay? She sort of behaves herself, sitting there nicely. I mean, I swear actually, where is she? Is she standing or sitting? Can you tell? Weird. So space becomes ambiguous after all this clarity? Wonder why that would be? Might be because he thinks he's got it wrong. We'll come to this later. But okay, but you get my point here, right? So what we've got to think about then is an image is really sort of a complex totality of the subject matter and the content and the form. And those all are working back and forth, affecting each other. And we just walk in the museum or the church innocently, and we look at a painting, and we say, wow, that's a nice painting. It's doing a lot of work on us. And we might not even quite realize it. Okay, give me some more. How about this motion? Like we've noticed this motion going across the picture plane. How does that work in relation to the depth, the space? Like where's he placed stuff? I love this. I'm getting you to really look. You're all like staring at this thing. It's fantastic.
It seems like they're both kind of in the middle between the surface of the window and the back wall of the room. Okay, if we think of this as planes of space, the surface, the window is this front plane. There's this kind of middle ground, and then there's this deep background. Right, and he places them on this stage between the picture plane and the depth. Okay, that's how he's placed them. Okay, what else now? How's he placing them?
I think it's interesting that there's a tree. It almost looks like it's stemming from the angel's head, you know? It's almost like he's bringing life or something.
Yeah, so what's with that? I mean, did Raphael just say, it looks kind of empty there, I've got to have something, let's throw a tree in, Or, yeah.
I feel like he puts in the deep background to slow your eye down, because otherwise, I mean, you have this really strong angel who's got this really strong motion, and Mary kind of stops that with how her body is.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like your eye would just shoot right off the picture if there was nothing there to slow it down. And with that really detailed background, it kind of makes you stop and look.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that phrase, slow your eye down. Yeah, I think that happens, doesn't it? I mean, you're right. This action is so fast, and even though she kind of curves, to absorb that action a bit, your eye spends time back there. Okay, all right, good. Now, I like this direction. Let's get into this. Like the placing of one form in relation to another form and what happens. Okay, we've talked about how this is happening in the interior here, this middle ground of space. I mean, after all, isn't this an interior event? Okay. So it makes sense that it's sort of in this indoor private space. But by placing the angel silhouetted here against the exterior, against nature, I mean, this is a spiritual being, right? This is nature. I mean, didn't we just say incarnation is about the divine entering the natural, entering the physical? So here we have the spiritual announcement occurring right in front of nature. God's about to enter nature by way of a woman. Okay, so there's a really interesting play there. All right, now given that, you mentioned the lily. Someone else mentioned the tree. Should we make anything of these objects? Well, the lily you already gave it away, right? We know the lily is a symbol of the Virgin Mary. All right, let's come back to that tree. Anyone want to mess with the tree?
I feel like it does have a certain importance because usually when you're painting a subject matter, you don't put it straight in the middle of something.
Yeah.
And this is like dead center of the window. So it does make it seem like it's important, and it's like, here I am, I'm a tree, looking at it.
Right. Now you see what she just did? Okay, she just relied on the formal language. Because that tree's in the middle, it does catch your eye. And we're going to assume Botticelli's no fool. He's in the museums. So therefore, he must have meant to do that. Why?
Could it symbolize the cross and the reason?
Yeah. Now see, here's what starts happening in your brain. Okay, we're looking now. This is what I love. We're looking, and we're looking at the language of forms, how they're placed. But then all of a sudden, we hit a puzzle. Okay, why that there? And then your brain goes back into your little data file, and you pull up some more subject matter. This is from the Bible, after all. There are a couple of important trees in the Bible. Way back. Tree of life. Tree of knowledge of good and evil. Fast forward, Jesus dies on a tree. Okay. I mean, there are some important trees. So, see how your mind starts to work back and forth from subject matter to form to content to knowledge and memory. But ideally, every worthy image we study, we should spend at least an hour just looking. I know, this is not realistic. And I don't do it either. But what I'm saying is, if you let your eye travel over every square inch of this painting and ask yourself, how is that square inch working with the whole? And why maybe did he do it that way? You would discover like phenomenal amounts about how this whole business works. Because an artist doesn't just sort of accidentally paint in, a window frame. He's thinking about it. Okay, so with that in mind, let me. This has been kind of like a meditation, right? Let me read you a meditation on this painting. You can just look at it. I'll read this thing. It's actually a poem by a living poet, Andrew Hudgens. And Andrew Hudgens has been looking hard at this painting. So we've seen our observations. Let's listen to his. Kind of see what we learn. It's just titled Botticelli, the Castello Annunciation, this is in the Castello collection. The angel has already said, "Be not afraid." He said, "The power of the Most High will darken you." Her eyes are downcast and half closed, and there is a long pause, a pause here of forever, as the angel crowds her. She backs up as far as she can. angel trapped against a reading desk. I mean, Botticelli's like brilliant. Let me look. He's got this that emphasizes that. He's got this rhyming with it. He's got a funny little planter out here, which every Renaissance girl would have known references a coffin, where this child will be buried, out of which will grow this tree that he was crucified on. It is also the tree of life. It pops up in the book of Revelation. Okay? I mean, this thing is so interwoven. Every form, every space, every gesture is sort of formally expressive of content and subject matter. Okay, so that's how a great painting works. Now, well, what's tragic is we don't have time to unpack every painting this way. Now, I mean, in my view, you would take art history, like 16 credits of it, one semester. We would live this stuff and breathe it, and we would come out, changed, I suppose. But you have to have other classes, So anyway, that's what we want to do. That's kind of our goal, is to really learn how to unpack visually, formally, merge that with content, subject matter, and arrive at a meaning. So I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is I finally, after a few years, gave myself permission to realize it's an unsolvable problem. So stop beating myself up. Stop worrying about it. Worry more about covering well what you do cover. Generally, my strategy is I try to use a good survey textbook so they can read and kind of get A through Z. It may be thin, but at least they've got the A through Z kind of timeline of things. And then I tell them in my lectures I'm going to pull out the key stuff that everybody in the major really needs to know. I'm going to go slow with it. I'm going to go in depth with it, and try to model with you how you take on certain key works and analyze them on every level. So therefore those works, but hopefully you also know how to approach other works because you've sort of modeled of how to pull it apart. So those are some of the things I do. But it's also kind of always a shifting paradigm. I mean, the canon's kind of changing all the time, and actually Bethel's changing a bit, and my students are changing. So I do tweak what I cover, but yeah, basically it's kind of those. That's my main structure, I think. Because no matter how things come and go, there are certainly certain cornerstones that always have to be addressed. So, I address those. I have found that the way I make some of these choices has changed in the 26 years I've taught here. I made this kind of list in thinking about this. I would characterize students when I started teaching. Their orientation was towards handmade things, not technological things. This shows how old I am. Their orientation was towards a nature-based aesthetic. And they actually were more in the habit of reading things slower, reading images slower. Today I look at it, and it seems like their orientation is towards simulacra, towards technology made, and towards multiplicity of images, not single, and reading things very, very fast. And so I do try to be sensitive to what I think is the climate of the students. And that has affected how I teach them. Sometimes it annoys them, but I do make a point of saying we have to really slow down on some things and learn how to get more deeply invested in them. Maybe get them to actually be looking at something with me for up to 20 minutes, where we're really unpacking that. So that, I think that's one of the things I do to determine what goes in. Then the other side of it does depend on which classes. My contemporary art history class is a constantly turning over thing because contemporary art's not sorted by art historians, so it's changing all the time. Renaissance art history, no matter how you cut it, there's these certain characters you got to know their works. So
it can vary from class to class as well in terms of how I choose material. I was thinking about what I do there, and again, it does vary a bit from course to course. Right now I'm developing this new art history survey course, which is freshmen, mostly 18, 19-year-olds, who are quite new to this. Most high schools don't have art history. And there I'm actually going to mix this up quite a bit. There'll be reading, there'll be lecture, there'll be field trips to the museum. But there's also going to, in addition to buying a text, they're actually going to buy a sketchbook and a watercolor pad. And they're going to draw and make watercolors of old master paintings to get their eyes and hands engaged. And then to some degree, depending on the course, I might use some video footage, although I'm not overly hot on that. So that's kind of at the freshman end. My middle courses, 200, 300 level, those are more experienced students, and there's so much to learn that I do tend more to lecture heavily and have some reading, and then field trips to the museums in town. My contemporary history class, the nature of how we encounter contemporary art is so different. It's mostly about walking into galleries and looking at things that people haven't sorted out yet. So I do that quite differently. I actually start every lecture with slides, and I say nothing. And they have to look at them, they have to make notations, they describe to me, we talk a little bit, and we kind of ask, how would you make sense out of this wacky thing you just encountered? You can't look it up, no one wrote about it yet. And from that we then back into a more lecture analytical format. So that, so it varies from class to class. I'm probably always the dictator in charge of in my mind, there is a body of information I feel needs to be delivered. So one way or another, I deliver that. And that's a dilemma. I mean, art history has a special problem. It occurs in the dark, which is actually not a good thing from the student attention standpoint. My heavier classes are 4 credits. They're Tuesday and Thursday. That's 110 minutes in a shot. So I do have things I do. I mean, first of all, I kind of view each lecture as a plot. I try to start with an inciting incident. This is very Aristotelian. Basically coming and saying, why should you care about this? Aside from just knowledge, why should you care about it? And I try to kind of build the lecture to a more climactic point. I try to often save some of the hardest hitting artworks to the end, so that I've kind of been building, and then this sort of really powerful work comes on at the end. On the other hand, I do other things. One is very mundane, which is I basically acknowledge that they're having a hard time at the end. That seems to help them, actually. If I kind of pause and say, let's take a deep breath, your eyes are rolling over in your head. I know you've been here in the dark for an hour and those chairs are hard. I think it helps kind of reconnect the humanness a little bit. It's also kind of a way of respecting them, that they're suffering. And so I'll do that. I'll change the pace of how fast I talk. I'll change the tone of my voice. I might ask some questions to get some observations, and we were talking about this before. Often when I do that, like when I'm lecturing, I'm up front, and it's sort of the teacher, the student kind of power structure, I guess. But often when I ask a question, it's a little intimidating, to try to answer, especially if they're not sure. So I'll actually, when I ask a question, I will often actually walk over towards them and turn around so I'm looking at the screen with them, sort of join them, and then solicit comments and sort them out, which I think helps. And one of the techniques I've developed, maybe I'm too soft here, but one of the techniques is no matter what they say, I mean, sometimes there's only like one syllable in there that is really usable. I always start with that and try to kind of like bring that to the surface and spin that a little bit, and then maybe show how the rest of it didn't quite hold up to that comment, and then throw it back out to the class to see if others will pick up and elaborate. It's kind of like a fishing expedition, and I find that if I handle them gently that way, they gain confidence, and I can usually get them to participate a lot more. So often at near the end of a lecture, if energies are clearly sagging, that's a really good device. Like turn, join them, and start just saying throw out words, and we'll make some of this together. So I do that kind of thing. I try to use the front of the classroom. I mean, in art history, it's all about that image up there. And so I'm there pointing, but I could, by walking back and forth, these are like cheap tricks, but I think it helps them, stay alert. No.